seen eye contact. I've watched attention to witnesses. And as someone who does jury trials, I have to tell you, I am grateful that you have listened and managed to keep the intensiveness that you've had for those 3 weeks. Because as you can imagine, this case has not only been hard for the plaintiffs, it's been hard for the defendants, it's been hard for the attorneys. And I think that was pretty evident by the emotional display we saw when the plaintiffs' attorneys were giving the first part of their closing argument. So thank you for all of that. Now, I kind of have some general thoughts to start with, which is we all want to believe that there's a consequence for your actions. It's kind of what we're taught from the time we're young. In fact, it's almost biblical. And we think that the wrongdoer is going to be caught, the sinner is going to be punished, that all of your actions have consequences, that you can't go get a gun, kill and shoot innocent people, and escape punishment. But unfortunately, life is not that black and white. In this case, Dmitry Pagourtzis is mentally ill. He's not had a trial, and he's not been held accountable for his crimes. And we can definitely feel, I mean, it's palpable, right? The level of frustration that the plaintiffs are feeling and the plaintiffs' attorneys are feeling for them, the angst they feel for their clients. That's partly why we're here. The feeling that Dmitry may be escaping punishment, the feeling that we need to blame somebody for what happened. In fact, if I were in their shoes, I can't tell you I wouldn't feel the same way. But feelings are not facts. And I completely disagree with Mr. McGuire about what he told you regarding the language in the jury charge that says you shouldn't let your feelings or bias prejudice you. Mr. McGuire said, well, that means that shouldn't keep you from writing a really big number on that line. I don't think that's what it means at all. I think what it means is that you have to put aside your feelings and biases, your feelings of sadness and empathy that you're naturally going to feel for the plaintiffs, that I feel for the plaintiffs, that my clients feel for the plaintiffs, that we all feel for the plaintiffs. Nobody's blaming plaintiffs in this case. Nobody wins in this case. Everyone has lost in this case. This case was lost before we ever walked through those doors. Now, putting aside your feelings and bias means that you try to look at the facts without the filter of the feelings, putting your sympathy and empathy to the side to just evaluate what's happened. And I know that sounds simple, right? But believe me, it's not quite so simple as we've seen here. Lawyers who are in trial all the time, this is their job, right? They get up here in front of juries and they talk to juries. That's what they do for a living. Yet they can't put their own feelings aside because this is a tragedy. And now we're asking you to do the same thing. And I realize it's a hard thing, but to evaluate the facts effectively, you have to put the feelings aside. And we hope that you'll be able to do that. Now, we all have great sympathy and empathy for what the plaintiffs have been through, but this is a search for the truth, which is what the whole trial is supposed to be about, right? You heard Mr. McGuire say that in his opening argument. It's supposed to be about your unfeeling analysis. It's supposed to be exactly what you're required to do to evaluate the facts of this case alone, so that justice is done in this case, and not to substitute the justice that the criminal case has failed to deliver to the plaintiffs so far, and the criminal case that they may never get. This case, from my perspective and from our position, is about these two people sitting right over here, Rose and Tony Pagourtzis. Plaintiffs want to place blame. It's natural to want to place blame, but where does the blame belong? When a hurricane comes, are we blaming God? Mental illness is an unseen, unknown tidal wave that can come and destroy not only the individual's life who is afflicted with a mental illness, but everyone around him. And that's what's happened in this case. So who are we going to blame? Well, let's look at the facts. We know that we had the unknown, unseen, and unshared mental illness of Dimitri. We had the unknown, unseen, and unshared failures of the school. And we had the unknown, unseen, and unshared actions of Lucky Gunner, who illegally sold ammunition to Dimitri. Now, I'll say this many times because I think it's important. Feelings are not facts. For 6 years, my clients have remained mostly silent. They've lived in fear. They don't like to go out because they're the parents of the monster, right? That's who they are. And you heard in their closing that they put up these great kids, and I don't doubt these kids were great. Everything I've seen about these kids makes me believe they were wonderful, amazing human beings. But their son got a mental illness. Their son is robbed of who he was. He is no longer the son that they raised. You don't have any control to tell mental illness to behave a certain way. This is what my clients have been dealing with for 6 years. Now, this case is really about what happened before May 18th, 2018. We're not really looking so much at what happened after that date when you're looking at the responsibility and blame for my clients, right? And in the search for whether or not they should be held responsible for anything, we've gotten into every area of their lives. We've gotten super far afield of what the facts are that we should be looking at, right? We've argued about whether or not Tony got mad watching the World Cup, whether the World Cup would even make you mad enough to throw a remote control, whether Rose's family carries genes for mental illness, whether or not my client should have known when their 3-year-old child had temper tantrums and drummed on his face that he was a budding psychopath. These are not the issues. The issues are what was going on in the life of this child, young adult, at the time this happened, and looking at the months and even the year before this all happened. It was not foreseeable, it was not predictable that their son would have a psychotic break, certainly not predictable that their son would become a school shooter. Now, as to all of the defendants, Mr. McGuire showed you the jury charge, and you're here to determine whether or not they were negligent. And what is negligence? How do we know it when we see it? Well, you've got some instructions on the charge, and we know that we all have a duty, right, to act within reason, to make sure that we use ordinary care so that we don't hurt each other. That's kind of what we already know. Ordinary care is defined as the degree of care that a person of ordinary prudence would use under the same or similar circumstances. You'll be determining if all the parties, or if any of the parties, or if none of the parties fall below this standard. So the relevant inquiry in your mind should be, did Rose and Tony use ordinary care regarding the safe storage of their weapons based on the facts and circumstances that they knew prior to May 18th, 2018? Now, you have to have a duty and you breach the duty, meaning you break that duty, right? So who failed in their duty? Well, right off the bat, right, you look straight to Dimitri. I think it's fairly uncontroverted that Dimitri developed a plan to be involved in a school shooting. It's uncontroverted that Dimitri acted in a furtive manner to make sure his plan wasn't discovered. Dimitri stole guns from his family home, finding a way to bypass the reasonable and prudent efforts that Rose and Tony had taken to safely store their weapons. And then Dimitri ordered ammunition online in furtherance of his crime. It's uncontroverted that Dimitri pulled the trigger. The parents didn't pull the trigger. The parents didn't give him a gun. The parents didn't give him permission. He never asked to look at or inspect or take a weapon. Parents certainly didn't consent to any of this. These are actions that Dimitri took. Now, there's some extra considerations you'll have to take, whether or not you believe Dimitri's mental health issues should mitigate his actions in some way, but that's for his attorney to argue, for Mr. Torres. But I think it's pretty clear that when you're looking at numbers of responsibility, that Dimitri has a large amount of responsibility in this matter. Now, I'm going to ask Ms. Goldsberry to put up the jury charge on the screen, and Mr. McGuire put this up for you earlier, and of course he thinks you should answer yes to every question. I don't think you should. I think you should definitely answer yes to Lucky Gunner, and let's talk about why. You should say no to Rose and Tony. You should say yes to Lucky Gunner. Lucky Gunner had a duty. Your question is, did they fall below the standards of ordinary care? That's a quick answer. They absolutely did, because Lucky Gunner violated state and federal law. There's a law in place that says you can't sell ammunition to an individual who's under the age of 18. They did that. Plaintiffs put on no evidence that any ammunition from the Pagourtzis family household was used in the shooting.
I'd like to object. That's not part of the court's charge. It's improper argument.
I don't know that I mentioned the charge.
You've been provided the court's charge, and you'll even have a copy of it to refer to during your deliberations, so you are to follow those instructions as given to you by the court. You may continue to say.
Thank you, Judge. And I expect I'm going to get interrupted multiple times, even though you noticed I did not do so with them. Because the reality is that they're trying to make a case from nothing. They're trying to take a bunch of little things that no ordinary person would see as problematic and turn it into something that it's not. Now, Lucky Gunner clearly broke the law, but what did Mr. McGuire tell you? Did he say 100%, 50%? He said 10%, even though he knows that they broke the law. Ask yourselves why. Why would he only assign them 10%? Now, it should be a pretty quick and clear determination for you to be able to figure out that Lucky Gunner should be held responsible. Now, I want to talk a little bit about my clients and their interactions with the school. And you are not going to see a line anywhere in your jury charge holding the school responsible. They're not a party in this lawsuit. However, you heard lots of arguing during the course of this trial about evidence. A lot of evidence we got late, a lot of evidence we didn't have context for, and you guys heard part of that, and it was probably confusing for you. But some of the records we got late were the school records, right? And in these school records, we found that the school had not notified Dimitri's parents that he had missed 57 days of school. Now, that's assuming that that record's right. I don't have any reason to think it would be wrong. But I'm going to ask Ms. Goldsberry to place that record up on the screen for us. And if she can blow that up for you a little bit, as we discussed the first time I put it up there, there is only a handful of times where the school says that they notified the parents that their son was absent. If he was indeed absent 57 days, that would have been a red flag and his parents would have done something. And you heard Rose testify. She was on Skyward. That's how she knew her son was failing. And you saw our exhibits here, right? We have two big exhibits. You're welcome to look at them when you're back in the jury room, filled with emails from Rose, initiated by Rose, because when she saw failing grades or she saw a problem, she would initiate contact with the school to try to solve it. This is probably why Dimitri, even though he was struggling from the 9th grade, had never failed a class, because mom would say, okay, what do we need to do to fix this? What's missing? What's the solution? And mom would find a way to fix that problem. And that's all there was to that. But if there was really 57 absences, how did he even pass the first semester? How come there wasn't a truancy letter? How come he wasn't arrested for truancy? We don't know the answers to any of those, but we do know that the parents weren't notified because they told you that. And we do know the parents weren't notified because the records say they weren't. This is another huge failure of the school. Now, you heard from multiple plaintiffs and from some of the witnesses as well, including Officer Barnes, who was one of the heroes of the day of May 18th, say that Dimitri had been wearing this trench coat to school. And it was pretty well known. You heard from multiple people. This was a known phenomenon, yet the school did nothing about it. They didn't even pick up the phone and say, hey, Mom, son is violating dress code. They didn't stop him and say, Dimitri, stop wearing that coat. They did nothing about that. And you heard Mr. McGuire very articulately and passionately tell you that we know that school shooters wear trench coats. We know that happens. So the parents should have done something. But the parents didn't see it because you heard from Dimitri, even though I don't think you should believe what Dimitri says. And it's interesting, plaintiffs want you to believe it when it benefits them, but they don't want you to believe him when it doesn't benefit them. I'll get to that. Nevertheless, we know the parents weren't seeing this. So Dimitri was either keeping this trench coat in his car, in his backpack, or maybe at the trailer where it wasn't seen by the parents. But the school took no action on this. Maybe if they had, this day wouldn't have happened, or at least he wouldn't have been able to sneak into the school unseen with weapons. That was all part of his plan. Now, plaintiffs have argued earlier in the case that Dimitri's mom bought him the trench coat. It's 100% true. He was involved in a video project for school called The Greatest Gatsby, and he wore that trench coat in there. This was around Christmas time. He wore the trench coat in the video along with a blonde wig. He was dressed as the Daisy character, for those of you that are familiar with the book. And after that, no one ever saw him at the family wear that duster again, because let's be honest, this is Texas. It's really hot. This jacket's hot for me. I can't imagine wearing a trench coat. So he wasn't wearing it except for effect. And that effect was at school, because as Mr. McGuire showed you, he fancied himself a school shooter. He admired school shooters. He wanted to be a school shooter. Now, whether or not this was a product of his mental illness, you'll have to decide. And again, that's for his attorney to argue. But those facts are pretty clear from his writings. Mr. McGuire showed you entry over entry where he talks about these things. So whether this was a product of his mental illness or not, this was clearly on his mind, and this is clearly what he had planned. Now, we have seen from Rose's parenting style, from these two large exhibits that I have in evidence up here with the emails from the mom, that she is very proactive. And her daughter called her a helicopter mom. I know that plaintiffs have complained about every parenting decision they've ever made since this child was 3 years old. But let's be real. Nobody searches their almost 18-year-old's room. In fact, that's a pretty gross violation of their privacy. That's not happening. Most people are not searching their 18-year-old's computers, although we did have one plaintiff that said she still searches her 20-year-old's computer. So I guess it varies from parent to parent, but in reality, when a person's becoming a young adult, they start to get a certain level of autonomy. And this is necessary, right? Because we're raising children to the point of 18. In our society, 18 is when you're ready to go off in the world on your own, ready to cut that umbilical cord completely and go be your own person. And there's steps as you get up to that, right? I mean, you're a baby, your parents carry you everywhere, you become a toddler, you walk on your own. You're in elementary school, your parents drive you to school, you get to junior high, you're allowed to walk, you get into high school, you get your own car. These are life events that occur, and as you grow up, you get more autonomy, you get more privacy as you become an adult. I think it's ridiculous to put the burden on these parents that they should have been searching this child's room. Searching a room for a young man who had never had any problems. He never had a detention in school. He didn't get in trouble for chewing gum. He'd never been suspended. He never failed a class. He'd never been violent. He'd never gotten in a fist fight. He'd never been arrested. He never got caught drinking, using drugs, smoking. What were the parents? Oh, wait, I know what it is. He played video games. He's in his room alone playing video games. Red flag, red flag. As a mother of 7 children, I'm telling you, they play video games. And as they get older, they like to spend more time playing video games. Now, whether or not this turned out in retrospect to be a small portion of a mental illness is easier to see in retrospect. At the time, it's not a terribly unusual behavior. No, I don't want to go out as much. I don't see how this is some big red flag. It's just not happening. Now, you did hear Mr. McGuire and some of the other plaintiffs talk about some of the documentation that Dr. Peterson spoke about. Now, you heard Dr. Peterson tell you himself, the word choices in my report were mine. So when he listened to everyone talk and he chose the word volatile, it's not because they said volatile, that's the word he chose. He also took individual events and put them into the report in such a way that it made it look like this might have been a persistent problem. And this is all part of the doctor's analysis. I'm not saying it's right or wrong way to do it, but you heard Rose and you heard Tony to the extent you could understand the stories we were talking about, that some of these events in Dr. Peterson's report, although they did happen, were one-time events. For example, the 3-year-old temper tantrum, fear of heights issue. Rose actually had paperwork. She still has paperwork from when the kids were in preschool and Mother's Day out. And she showed him one where a teacher one time sent home a report that said, we were up on the slide today and Dimitri was afraid to go down because he was afraid of heights and he threw a tantrum. And somehow that got written in such a way that it made it look like it was a more persistent behavior. Now, to Dr. Peterson, when he's looking at all the pieces, to him it might be. But what was reported from the family is that it was a one-time event. So as the person perceiving this, as the person living this in real time, as the person who's not going back after something horrible has happened and looking at what's happening in the here and now, that doesn't look like a red flag. Now, what would look like a red flag? When the school failed to monitor their computer systems and allowed Dimitri to conduct searches of a nature that should have set off immediate alarm bells. Ms. Goldsberry, if you would put up the searches such as Columbine evidence photos, 357 revolver, and Virginia Tech shooters. These should draw some attention by school officials. Now, plaintiffs may argue that we don't know for certain that these came off of the school records, but you can look at these exhibits. If you'll put up the exhibits, we had Clayton Horn on the stand and he testified these look very much like the block warnings that he got from his school computer when searches were done that were inappropriate searches where you couldn't get around the firewall. And we have documents and evidence. You can take a look at some of these. You also heard Clayton Horn say that he had an individual login for his computer. I believe Ms. Giannis said she thinks her son did. I'm not 100% that's who said it. One of the plaintiffs did, as well as Rose, who still has the login for her son for the school computer. Now, what about Tony and Rose? Well, you've heard me say that they didn't fail in their legal duty. First of all, Dimitri was almost 18 years old. He was about 4.5 months away from being 18. At age 17, you can consent to sex. You can consent to your own psychological treatment. If you run away from home, the cops aren't going to bring you back home. And most importantly, at age 17, when you commit a crime, you're charged as an adult. And in this case, Dimitri was indeed charged with his crime as an adult. Now, unlike Dimitri and Lucky Gunner, Tony and Rose did not commit any crime. And despite a slightly dramatic moment where a plaintiff seemed to indicate that Tony and Rose might be charged with a crime in the future, that's 100% untrue, because Rose and Tony did not break any penal statute at all. In fact, Rose and Tony completely cooperated with the police after the shooting occurred. And as we discussed in voir dire, Tony and Rose had no obligation by statute to lock up their guns to keep them from Dimitri. He was old enough to bear that adult responsibility. Yet, Tony and Rose did have their guns locked up, all of them being safely stored either in the gun cabinet or the gun safe. Still, due to Dimitri's age, Rose and Tony had no obligation to hide the keys from Dimitri. But they did. They had the keys hidden in a safe place. And Mr. McGuire's 100% wrong. The keys were not in the kitchen. The keys were not kept in a common area. If you'll recall from our direct testimony, we put up the pictures. The keys were kept in the top of a cabinet that is 8 feet off the floor in the parents' private bedroom. Now, they could have left the guns on the table. They had no duty under criminal law to lock those guns up, because I guarantee you, if they had broken a criminal law, they would have been charged with it. But they didn't. And nevertheless, they were locked up, and nevertheless, the keys were hidden. But that's not enough, right? Because plaintiffs are now telling you that I guess they should have locked the keys up too. I guess they needed a separate lockbox to lock up the keys to keep them from a kid they had no duty to keep the keys from. Or maybe bury them in the backyard. I don't know. Mr. Torres pulled out a key in a dramatic moment for all of us, I thought was really fun, to kind of indicate he had his key in his own pocket. That's fine. I mean, it's a thing. You could do that. But that doesn't mean you have an obligation to do it. And it also doesn't mean that you have a reasonable ability to foresee the criminal acts of another human being. You don't know what you don't know. And I appreciated the homage that they put up to me in their closing argument. But I really think that Socrates got it right. You can't know what's going on in somebody else's head, because if we did, we wouldn't have any homicides. We wouldn't have any suicides. We wouldn't have any crime at all, because anyone who remembers the Minority Report movie, we could recognize it before it happened and we could stop it. But as humans, that's not how we function. We're not telepathic. We don't have those abilities. We do the best we can with the observable behavior that we have. And if he had been breaking the law, if he had been violent, if he had been using drugs, if he had been abusing animals or setting fires or holding a magnifying glass on ants, anything, then maybe you'd go, we need to look at that. He had slipping grades, but he never failed. He started to want to spend a little bit more time alone. These were the two main things that you saw. And he wasn't isolated or barricaded. We showed you pictures. Let's show you some more, Ms. Goldsberry. If you'll put those pictures up. These are pictures in the months, just months right before the shooting took place. This is Dimitri the summer before in Greece. Does he look like he's got some social anxiety where he's barricading himself in the room? No, he traveled to a foreign country. He's visiting with relatives and friends. He's taking younger children around on a four-wheeler. Does this look like a child that you would think, dang, he's depressed, man, look at that? No, there were no signs of depression here, none whatsoever. Let's go to some of the other pictures, Ms. Goldsberry. We see him with big smiles with his family members. We see him posing for pictures. This is very close to the time of the shooting. We see a kid with a hat and a big smile. We don't see a kid barricaded in a room who looks depressed. If someone showed you a picture of this kid without any other context, would you say, that kid really needs to get some mental health intervention? Because that's the kid that Rose and Tony saw every day until he had a psychotic break. And their lives and his lives, and God love them, all of the plaintiffs, and God bless every single one of them. Their lives were forever and changed irrevocably so. Now, if it had been foreseeable to these folks that there was a simmering mental illness, they would have done something about it. You heard Tony say that his son went on a diet and intentionally lost weight, about 20 pounds. And Tony was concerned. He's like, man, you shouldn't lose that much weight. And even though Rose had already taken them to his regular doctor, Tony's like, no, I'm a little worried about this. Took him to a separate doctor to get checked because he was worried about that. That was over some weight loss. If they had seen any mental illness, they certainly would have acted on it. Looking back now, can we say it was mental illness? I don't think you can based on the signs that they saw. But when the break happened, when the psychotic break happened, all hell broke loose, literally and figuratively. And you heard Dr. Self tell us about the signs and symptoms of schizoaffective disorder and schizophrenia, and how it slowly builds over time, and those behaviors, those signs, those symptoms look like normal adolescence, normal childhood, normal teenage angst. There is not necessarily anything that would alert a reasonable and prudent parent to think their child was mentally ill. She said until they have that first break. And when they have that first break, then you're able to see what happens. And heaven knows it is the most tragic thing that the first time this kid does anything really wrong is irredeemable. He can't come back from this. The plaintiff's children can't come back from this. The people who are injured can't come back from this. Tony and Rose will never get their kid back. He can't come back from this. Now, it doesn't really matter. There's been a whole lot of to-do about whether the guns were in the wooden cabinet or the black cabinet because Dimitri said so. And as I told you over and over again, and as Dr. Peterson confirmed, just because Dimitri says it doesn't make it true. Now, plaintiffs want you to believe it when things are easily corroborated, right? Like Dimitri told the police, if you go to my room, I left guns there, I hid them, you can find them. Sure enough, police went, found the guns. But Dimitri also told police, yeah, there's alcohol and cigarettes in my room. FBI searched that room extensively. We've got picture after picture after picture of Dimitri's room, in the drawers, in the closet, on the bed, under the bed, beside the bed. There's no pictures of alcohol or cigarettes. So just because he says it doesn't mean it's true. It doesn't mean everything he says is wrong, but important things could be wrong. For example, saying the key was on top of the wooden cabinet. You heard Rose say it wasn't. You heard Vossi say when she needed her jewelry, her mom went in the other room and got the key and come unlock the shelf. But even if it was there, even if the keys were left in the lock itself, they didn't break any laws. They didn't do anything wrong because they didn't have a duty to do that. It wouldn't have been unreasonable. But plaintiffs want to build all of these signs of mental illness to say they should have had a heightened duty, that wasn't enough. The fact that he wasn't 17, that's not enough. Because something tragic happened, that's not enough. And I don't disagree with them. Something tragic happened. Everyone in this room wishes it hadn't, but it did. But it's not because Tony and Rose failed to safely store their guns. Rose and Tony safely stored their guns. Their son or anyone else with a criminal intent could have searched the house and found those keys. You saw in some of Dimitri's writings where he was talking about different ways he wanted to try to get a gun, right? Even though he knew the parents' guns were there, and as Mr. McGuire rightfully pointed out multiple times, all he had to do was like break that glass and he could have gotten a gun. He never did that because he knew that would trigger an observation and his parents would jump into action. Just like when he got his own Amazon Prime account. He had his mother's credit card. He had that so he could get fuel to get to school lunches, whatever he needed to get. And if he ever used it, which Rose told you he did one time, he got a game on Steam for his computer. Rose immediately said, hey, that's not an authorized purchase. He purchased something from Amazon and Rose told you, she said, hey, I didn't tell you you could buy that. Now, that was a ball cap and some t-shirts. It wasn't like something that was malicious, but Rose immediately caught that because she's constantly monitoring her children. So he knew that was going to happen. So he took steps to be furtive so that he wouldn't get caught. It's really ironic because Mr. McGuire has argued, and I don't disagree with him. Dimitri does say in his confession video, I thought they would notice this. But if you look at the context of that, it is absolutely not clear that he's talking about his parents. In fact, it sounds more like he's talking about school officials. Because if he wanted his parents to see something, break that glass. If he wanted his parents to see something, break open that bottom door. If he wanted his parents to see something, use mom's credit card. If he wanted his parents to see something, drive their car drunk. None of these things happened. Instead, what he did was he was sneaky. He was sly. He did not want to get caught so that he could carry out his plan, because he knew if he had gotten caught, they would have stopped it. And again, I'm going to draw your attention back to the you don't know what you don't know. And to me, it's amazing how Socrates was able to succinctly identify that problem. After something happens and we see the course of events and the chain of events, it's certainly easier to go, oh, I see that now. But in this case, that's not even clear. Because if you look back at what was actually happening at that time, it certainly wasn't any evidence that there was mental illness going on, even less evidence that their son was going to commit a crime, and absolutely zero evidence that he was going to commit a school shooting, at least from what the parents saw. Now, what the school saw is a completely different thing. They saw a kid wearing a trench coat to school that apparently had these pins of power, or whatever he identified them as. You think the school would pay attention to that. You think the school would pay attention to the searches because they have IT people that do that. This isn't parents at home trying to search their kid's computer, right? I mean, you've got an almost 18-year-old young man who had a computer for right at a period of 5 months. Everything that you saw in court came off that computer, other than some paper journal pages, and it's pretty clear which is which when you look at the pictures. 90% or so, and I didn't do the math for you engineers, I'm just saying, the large proportion of what you saw came off of his computer. And he only had that computer for a period of 5 months. So we know the time period in which this was happening. And it seems from his writings, at least, that he was spiraling in his head during this time period. But he didn't share these writings with his parents. He didn't share them with anyone. And during this 5-month period, there's a lot of stuff going on, right? When you're looking at what's reasonable for these parents to do. During this 5-month period, we've got one mother on hospice. We've got another mother who is very ill. We have a brother who has died. All of this going on within this 5-month period of time. Now, during this 5 months, you did hear Rose say she had actually been on the computer. She didn't see anything, but she didn't search it. Same thing with Vossi. She had been on the computer. She didn't see anything, but she didn't search it. Now, what we do know is, from Dimitri's own words, is that he said a lot of the documents that we're looking at here in court, he had deleted from his computer. So the context that we're missing from the evidence we have is that even if a Rose had searched this computer, would she have even seen this? Because if these are deleted files that the FBI recovered off of the hard drive, Rose wouldn't have seen that. If these are deleted files that the FBI recovered, Vossi wouldn't have seen that, but we're going to hold her responsible because she didn't see it? It doesn't make sense. That's not reasonable. That's not what a reasonable parent would do. A reasonable parent wouldn't remove their kid's hard drive when nothing had happened and go get it analyzed by an IT specialist. That's not reasonable. Now, Mr. McGuire told you in his opening statement that the shooting itself was premeditated, and certainly concede that point to him. All the evidence supports that. He made plans, he made nasty comments about what he wanted to do, he took actions in furtherance of that plan, including buying the ammunition, including stealing the guns from his parents. And as I mentioned earlier, he had talked in several other places about different ways to try to get these guns. It seems that getting the guns from the parents was his last resort, because he talks about trying to maybe get a fake ID so that he can either go to a gun show or go somewhere and buy a gun. But he says in his writings that he didn't have enough money to do that anyway, so he had to abandon that. There's also some information where maybe he asked another kid for a gun. So he had considered other ways to get guns because he knew taking guns would trigger alert with his parents, which is why he took the guns out of the black cabinet in the garage, because it wouldn't be as obvious. As you saw from the pictures in this case, the gun cabinet, even though it's off in the corner of the living room, it's there enough. You see how the guns are stacked. If one is missing, it's going to leave a gap, and that's going to be noticeable. He took them from the other cabinet because he didn't want to be caught. If he wanted to be caught, he would have broken it open. He would have left the cabinet open when he found the keys. He could have done any other number of things, but he didn't because he wanted to hide what he was doing. Now, you have to filter this through the evidence that Dimitri was in the throes of a psychotic break. And again, that's going to be for you to determine if that should mitigate his accountability or not. Dimitri's not my client. I leave those arguments for Mr. Torres. But remember that these efforts that he took to hide the evidence from his parents means they didn't see it, right? And I agree with Mr. McGuire on another thing. I know it's hard to believe we agree on some things. He is right. You don't always know when an Amazon package is going to be delivered, or do you? All you have to do is check the tracking, and it tells you how many stops away your package is. You've got an idea when that package is going to be delivered. And if it's not delivered before you get home, you've got a pretty good idea of when it's going to be delivered, and you can run out there and grab it before anybody sees it. And it's not reasonable to hold the parents responsible for furtive actions of their son that they wouldn't have seen. Now, there's a lot of red flags they talked about. I'm just going to kind of run through some of them. We talked about them in opening. We talked about them throughout the course of the hearing. You know, this financial red flag that he spent $1,700. You heard from the witnesses that he had money that he received for birthdays, holidays. There's extra Greek holidays, other things that he received money for. You heard Katina say that her dad always has cash. It's even possible he stole cash. And Tony even told you from time to time he would give the kids 15, 20, 30 bucks. So as far as him having money, I'm not sure what the financial red flag was there, other than the parents should have known he was spending money that they didn't know he was spending. It's hard for me to figure out. But the reality is that he did have some of his own money, and he did order stuff, and it was delivered to him. There are certainly receipts to show that that happened, including for Lucky Gunner. Now, some of the items that he ordered, they're not all nefarious. You heard Mr. McGuire say something about, don't hold me to it if I get the number wrong. He had 29 packages delivered to his house, which might be true, but some of these are T-shirts. Some of them are sunglasses. Some of them are items that aren't nefarious. Now, certainly bear spray is a really weird thing to order, and tactical gear is clearly something that would be concerning, especially for a kid that hadn't been using guns and to their parents' knowledge didn't like or use guns. That would certainly probably have gotten their attention. But let me point another thing out to you, that in all of those FBI pictures, other than a couple of those items, there are some of those items in the picture. There's some knives and some other items there, but a lot of the other items don't show up in the pictures. So some are there and some are not. Was he keeping him in the car? Was he keeping him at the trailer? We don't know. And the parents wouldn't know that either because they don't know what they don't know. "30 minutes, Judge? Thank you." Okay. Now, some of the other red flags here, well, let me just say one more on the financial just to let you know. It's clear that he didn't use the parents' credit cards. It's clear they didn't give him $1,700 to go buy these things. So we know that much. We also know that he went and purchased cash cards in another effort to evade detection, because if he had used those credit cards belonging to his parents, he would have gotten caught. Now, these social red flags is a bit more of an enigma for me, because here we have a kid that over the years has engaged in all kinds of extracurricular activities: soccer, baseball, football, karate, band, Greek dancing, piano lessons, all of these things. I don't see that as a big red flag. In fact, if you look at the picture here, if Ms. Goldsberry will put it up, at the Greek dancing, this was 4 days or 5 days before the shooting occurred. He is out in public, he is dancing, he's involved in this community activity, he's performing. A lot of people have performance anxiety. I mean, that's a thing, even if you're not afraid to be out in crowds, performing, standing up in front of people, doing public speaking or performing causes anxiety. But here he is out there doing this, and he was dancing still in 2 troops. And this was just 4 or 5 days before the shooting occurred. A kid who's out there dancing, you don't see that kid as depressed. And you also heard Dr. Self tell you that if someone is suffering with depression, they are not actively making plans. They're not Googling how to make bombs. They're not out trying to figure out how to hide orders of materials from their parents. They're not actively engaged and involved in any kind of action, much less something that required so many steps in planning as this did, including learning and teaching himself how to modify weapons so that he could do the maximum damage to people, and learning how to make bombs so that he could harm folks. That's not what a depressed person would do. And you heard that from Dr. Self as well. Now, you saw a whole bunch of these computer surveys, and I went through a bunch of these with you earlier, and I'm just going to remind you briefly because, there goes my timer, sorry. Mr. McGuire, in direct testimony, often pulled 1 or 2 of these and said, look at this, he's cutting himself, the parents should have seen that. There's really a big mischaracterization of the evidence. 6 times maybe he said he was cutting himself, 33 times he says he's bottling up his emotions in response to the same answer. So you're not getting a full picture. And again, let me remind you, the person answering these surveys, the person making these writings is delusional. Now, one Mr. McGuire pointed out yet again was the massacre, the day before the massacre. We know that mom knew he was depressed because Dimitri said so. And in that writing, Dimitri says, the day before the massacre, my mom said to me, what's wrong with you? Are you depressed? Well, Mr. McGuire said, well, that really wasn't the day before the massacre. It was like 2 days before the massacre. I don't know if he forgot, but I hope that you don't forget that I told you that that same quote in one form or another appears 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times in the context of his 776 pages. The first time it appears on page 116, then it appears again on 172, 352, 355, 346, I got that one out of order, sorry, and 735. So clearly, this is not a truthful recount of something that happened. This reads like a fictional writing, and it goes along with all of his other delusional thoughts. Now, looking at the other social media red flags that the plaintiffs point out, Dimitri did open a Facebook page a couple of weeks, like 2.5, 3 weeks before the shooting occurred. And it seems to me, I don't know how it seems to you, that he was doing that to intentionally memorialize things so that after the event occurred, you could look back and see that. Because we know he was fascinated with school shooters based on his writings. And so he posted a picture of his trench coat, right? And Mr. McGuire said the parents should have seen that and the parents should have been upset about it. Really? Number one, there's no evidence, even though Mr. McGuire says this is a public page, there's no evidence that they didn't have their family, that Dimitri didn't have the family blocked. Furthermore, if the school wasn't startled by him wearing that every day at school, then why would the parents be startled by seeing a picture of it on social media? That seems unlikely to me. And to be clear, even though as a parent myself, if I saw those, it would certainly make me go, what's going on here? He didn't make any threats, overt threats or warnings or forecasts on there. Although one could say that the t-shirt itself, which there is no evidence is a custom t-shirt, by the way. Born to Kill is a phrase that comes from a popular movie, Full Metal Jacket. So we don't know that that was a custom t-shirt unless Mr. McGuire has a separate receipt. And if he does, I apologize. I figure it's an Amazon order. I didn't investigate that closely enough to be 100% on that idea. But there was nothing other than a picture of the shirt that indicated anything else was going on. And there's no evidence that the parents or any family member saw it. And the plaintiffs didn't bring in anybody else to say, this was a public page, the parents were not blocked, there were no IT specialists here. And the same with Dimitri, right? I mean, Mr. Todd, who is very learned and did a very good job cross-examining the experts, he's like, you're free to believe some of what they say, none of what they say, and that's 100% correct. But what they didn't do was bring in an expert who said, that guy is wrong, Dr. Peterson is wrong, Dr. Self is wrong. That didn't happen. Now, Rose did tell you that previously Dimitri had a social media account when he was about 15, and she did monitor it. But he closed it, and to her knowledge, he never had one until he opened it here. You also heard the nosy little sister say, I would go do checks on social media. I would go looking to see if he had a social media account, and I never found any because I wanted to see what Big Brother was up to. So there is no evidence that these were forward-facing public pages as far as the family was concerned. Now, as to the other social red flags, there were some suggestions that the fact that he only had 1 or 2 friends was a big social red flag, but some kids are that way. I've got some kids that are pack animals. When they were young, they ran around with a tribe of children, and I've got some that had only one. In fact, my son, who is my legal assistant that's been here with me, he only had one best friend all the way through high school. They were together all the time. Just different personalities. There's no idea that that would be a red flag that an individual has a mental illness. Now, there is definitely some merit to the fact that failing grades is a flag. Now, whether it's a red flag or a yellow flag or just a flag, certainly that's something that will require action. And as soon as the grades dropped, we see Rose jumping into action. She jumped up to pull that flag off the flagpole. She tried to figure out what he needed to do to fix it and how to solve that problem. Now, speaking of those emails, you saw Mr. McGuire put that email up saying that it's the email where Rose is talking about she had been gone for a while and she felt so bad and she didn't know what was, going to happen with Dimitri. And they kind of tried to paint that in the context that the email was about mental health. It wasn't. The email was about Rose finding out that her son had plagiarized a paper. And Rose took that so personally. I can't believe my son would do that. That's not who my son is. And she was very upset about that. I mean, in my opinion, overly upset about that. But that had nothing to do with mental health. There's no evidence whatsoever that any individual in any capacity, whether it be at the school, at the church, in the community, anywhere, that anyone told Rose, hey, your son is doing X. This looks problematic. You might want to go get him checked. That never happened. Now, the absences we talked about, that is definitely a failure on behalf of the school. That is very problematic, and I promise you, if a Rose had seen that, that would have been a problem. She was on Skyward. She saw the grades. You heard her testify that she did not see those absences there. We now have no way of knowing whether they were on Skyward or not. Plaintiffs would have you believe they were. She doesn't remember seeing them. I guarantee you, if she had seen them, she would have taken action. Now, again, to those physical issues about Dimitri cutting himself, there was zero evidence Dimitri was cutting himself. Mr. McGuire told you that you should know that there's a problem because of the physical signs. And there was some talk about him not showering as often. You heard Rose talk about these, right? These are isolated incidents that are taken out of context. So Rose told you as a teenage boy, his hygiene wasn't what she wanted it to be. He had school football, he was showering at school, but he wasn't always showering at home. And so sometimes she would have to remind him. But she told you when she reminded him, he would go do it. She thought he was being lazy. He wasn't wanting to do his chores. He had some lack of motivation. These are the things that the parents saw. And it's not unreasonable for them to think this is normal teenage behavior or a phase or a mood that would move on. There was no indication of any depression or deep, serious mental illness or any mental illness at all. And these children, both of her children growing up, they were getting regular doctor's visits. They were going to see a doctor who evaluated these kids. And then Dimitri got even extra times at the doctor, other than wellness checks, other than times when he was ill, because he was in sports, multiple sports, and band, which requires additional physicals to be done. And doctors who examined him never saw any symptoms or signs that they thought were problematic and said, hey, Mom, you might want to get this looked at. Because if they had, she would have done something about it. And Dad would have done something too, even though Mom is the primary one who handled the children's education, as you heard from the testimony. Now, in plaintiff's opening statements, they talk about how Dimitri stated he doesn't feel treated like a son. But again, this is a product of Dimitri's delusional state. You've all heard the testimony from Dr. Peterson, where he explained how all of Dimitri's interpersonal relationships, meaning how he related to other people, were tinged and colored by his paranoia and fearfulness. And the most important part, not likely reality. So when you look at things he writes about relationships, for example, I think it's common sense. The things he writes about his schoolmates and feeling ostracized, it's unlikely that schoolmates were treating him that way. Definitely not to the degree he seems to feel it, right? Because that would have drawn attention by a teacher or somebody if that kind of behavior was going on. This was part of Dimitri's delusional state. Now, we talked a little bit about what Mr. McGuire talked about, these intentional signs. And if there was any intent to be intentional, it was at school. And if you re-listen to the clip Mr. McGuire played, you can see, if you agree with me, that it sounds more like he's talking about it in the context of school and not the parents. But there were a million ways for him to make his illness, his suffering, known to his parents, not the least of which are the 3 times that we heard about in the last 5 months before the shooting, where Rose pulled both of her children aside, and even her adult, her 30-plus-year-old stepdaughter, and talked to them about mental illness. When her brother committed suicide, talking to both of them about, if you ever feel this way, talk to me. And whatever happens, don't do anything to take yourself away from me. That's the perfect time to say, Mom, I'm having these awful feelings. After the school shooting in Parkland, she talked to both of her kids and talked about what a tragedy it is, and was, no doubt, and told them, don't ever let your anger or your sadness or your grief or whatever's going on, don't ever let yourself feel that way. If you ever need help, come and tell me. And she would have gotten help for them. But he never said a word. Because of his paranoia, he didn't want to talk about this. He didn't want to talk about Natasha. And Mr. McGuire might be right. Natasha may be a delusion that began from a character in a video game. We used to play is it not Frankenstein? It's Wolfenstein, right? I think, back when my children were younger, and that may indeed be a character, but that doesn't mean that he didn't develop a delusional belief about a character in a video game. A delusion's a delusion, right? It doesn't have a basis in reality. So whether it was just an original manifestation or it was a product of a video game, I think is irrelevant. The fact is that he had the delusion, and you find from his writings that he does talk about extraterrestrials and elder gods and supernatural beings, albeit he didn't talk about that as much as he did later with Dr. Peterson and others, because once the psychotic break happened and he could no longer hide it, then he could talk about it. After the CIA didn't assassinate him, after the school shooting happened, he could talk about it. And apparently that's what he did with Dr. Peterson. Now, the plaintiffs also said something interesting in their opening argument. They said, we filed this case against Demetrios himself because Demetrios intentionally caused bodily harm to another. And in Texas, when you intentionally cause bodily harm to another, you're responsible for all of the harms and losses that you caused. Now, if that's true, according to their analysis, hold Demetrios 100% responsible for what happened. That is something you can do. And according to plaintiffs' opening arguments, that's a verifiable thing that is a legitimate analysis of what's happened here. I certainly think Lucky Gunner deserves some responsibility as well, but that's for you to decide. Now, the plaintiffs have seemed to want to walk a tightrope in this case. Dimitri wasn't so mentally ill that he shouldn't be held responsible in the civil case. We don't want you to find him insane. He wasn't that sick. He knew what was right from wrong, but we want to argue that he was depressed so that we can make the parents responsible. All of the evidence is to the contrary. Dimitri has not stood trial because he's mentally incompetent. Dimitri has been evaluated by Dr. Peterson and been found to be mentally incompetent. Dimitri is living in a delusional state right now. That's where he is. That's the evidence. The evidence isn't that he had some minor or major depressive disorder. That's not what he had. That's not what he has. But it makes it easier, right? Because they know they're not going to get a recovery from Dimitri because he's going to be either in a mental institution or a prison the rest of his life. That's a given. The parents are the only, and Lucky Gunner are the only other two options here to get a recovery. If this is really about justice and not about money, then you can write zeros in the amount for all of those, and you can hold whoever you want 100% responsible. But it's not just about that. If it's just about justice, we would wait for the criminal trial, and the criminal would be tried, and then we would see what the justice was. That's what justice is. This is trying to hold the parents responsible for a horrific event that affected them as well and made victims out of them also. Now, this is my last opportunity. Judge, mine shows an hour and 3 minutes. I have an hour and 20 minutes, right?
You do.
Okay, I show 1:03, so I should still have about 17 minutes? Okay. I just want to make sure before I get too far afield here. Okay, so I lost my train of thought there with the time warning, so I apologize. The reality is that Dimitri committed this crime. He took these guns. And we know that insanity and intelligence are not mutually exclusive. It is possible to be both at the same time. And I know the plaintiffs don't want to believe that there weren't red flags. And I'm going to share with you a little bit why I feel so much for these defendants. First of all, I want to tell you that this is the last moment that I have to talk with you.
Well, any personal comments are
No,
improper or...
no, they're not.
This is closing argument. What the attorneys say is not evidence, and you'll be determined in this case based upon the evidence and testimony that's been admitted during this case.
Thank you, Judge. And you'll see the reason why that just happened. First of all, it's the last chance I'm going to have to talk to you. And they're going to get up and remember things that I forgot to say. They're going to go back and find something that I don't have an opportunity to respond to. So I'm going to ask you to remember, try to think what I would say if I had an opportunity to address that, because most of the big issues we addressed in trial. But the reason I wanted to share with you a personal experience and why I have so much compassion for Rose and Tony is because it could be me. That could be me sitting right there. My son died 5 months ago. He had schizophrenia. He was more of an introvert than an extrovert. He liked to play video games.
We're going to have to object to this.
Your Honor, you can share personal stories in closing.
Nothing like that.
I can share the case if you'd like to know it.
Approved.
fact, it's the opposite. They did more than their duty required of them. And they did it willingly to try to safely store their guns. There's nothing that keeps any criminal, whether it be your own son, your own daughter, or any other person, from committing a criminal act. We had the one witness who was talking about his almost impenetrable gun safe. It weighs 300 pounds. Okay, so you get two men to go pick it up and carry it out of your house. I mean, there's always a way around security if you're intent on committing a crime. And that's what this young man did. And again, mental health part of that is for you to consider, and Mr. Torres will talk to you about that. But Rose and Tony should not be held responsible for the young adult that did this, whether it was his mental illness or not. There's no evidence they knew he was mentally ill and they ignored it. They would not have done that. They're a very loving and close family, even if there's some temper and normal things that most of us have in their household. Even if they got into a fight one time and Rose says, "I'm going to divorce you." My husband's over there. I've said that to him I don't know how many times this week. That's what happens when people get mad. You say things that you don't mean. It doesn't mean that you don't love your spouse. It doesn't mean you don't love your family. It means that you had an argument and you lost your temper. That happens. You heard from Dr. Peterson that there was no reports of any kind of violence in this household, physical violence. Now the temper of Tony is kind of up in the air, whether you believe he's volatile or not, and may have thrown a few things a few times. You'll decide what you believe from what the witnesses said. But what's very clear is the report, even from Dimitri himself, says there was never any physical violence. So there weren't any actions in the home that was taken by these parents that caused what happened. There's not any actions that they should have been aware of that they could have done. Now, in hindsight, we all know is easy. We can all say, they should have taken those guns and buried them in a landfill somewhere. They should have, taken them and had them melted down for spare parts. And surely if something like this was foreseeable, they would have done that. We can't foresee every bad thing that happens in life. Some things happen through no fault of our own. This is certainly through no fault of the plaintiffs. They didn't ask for this. They didn't deserve this. But for whatever reasons, Dimitri picked up a gun and he took action. Rose and Tony didn't pick up a gun. They didn't do this. They didn't give consent. They didn't give permission. They didn't give him the keys. They didn't give him the guns. And the guns weren't readily dischargeable. He had to go and buy ammunition for them, which is what Lucky Gunner gave him, when he shouldn't have. So I'm asking that you find Rose and Tony legally responsible for what happened. Now, emotionally, they feel terrible, and they're going to be scarred for the rest of their life because this is what their son did, and they wish they had seen it. They really do. But they can't go back and change that. None of us can. But look at what they knew and when they knew it, and were their actions reasonable? And I think common sense tells you it is. You remember during the trial, I made a comment about there was no statute that required them to act differently. And Mr. McGuire jumped up and said, "What about the law of common sense?" Okay, well, the law of common sense is great, but they did more than common sense would say. They locked them up. Common sense would say you just put them out of reach. They locked them up. The fact that their son searched the house to find the keys to steal the guns is not foreseeable. So that is our request, that you put 0 on both of theirs. Divide the responsibility equally between Dimitri and Lucky Gunner if you want. If you think Dimitri's mental illness mitigates it, put 100% on Lucky Gunner, because if he didn't have those bullets, the shooting wouldn't have happened. There's no evidence that any of the bullets came from the parents' house. I thank you again for your time and your attention. I know it's been a long 3 weeks. I appreciate you more than you know. My clients appreciate you more than you know. And I know you've got a hard job ahead of you. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Court will stand at recess till 3:15.
up anything yet, on a case, and he told me. At the time, I thought about passing on this, giving him an excuse, but then I remembered a line from one of the Godfather movies, "This is the business that I've chosen. And this is the business that I've chosen." Nothing, you know what? If they ask for $1 billion, they deserve it. Who is Roberto Torres to say they don't deserve it? I would have paid $2 billion to save my son. So this isn't about damages. They deserve it. It's about who should be held accountable and who should pay it. And since 1999, in the legislatures and what have you, presidential campaigns, it's always the same thing. Put it on the shooter. Guns don't kill people, people kill people. It's always the same thing. We let them off the hook because it's easier to pick on one severely mentally disturbed young man who's going through a living hell. It's easier. Who wants to take on the big gun industry? Who wants to blame parents? It's easier. Let's just blame the sick guy. It's cold world, blood. That's all I can say. Demetrius has been used like a shield by the plaintiffs when it's convenient for them. And then he's used like a shield by his parents when it's convenient for them. His mom said, "I feel like he betrayed me." Who's betraying who? It's as simple as this. No ammo, no one gets shot. No guns, no one gets shot. It's that simple. Well, I guess the plaintiffs could come back or the parents could come back and say, well, no shooter, nobody gets shot. True enough. But Dimitri isn't all there. You know that. We don't need 3 psychiatrists to come in here. They know that because they didn't bother to bring a psychiatrist here to say something different. You can see a slow descent into hell. Exhibit 2, Plaintiff's Exhibit 2, the journal. When I first got this case and I saw that material, I said, oh my God, man. How could somebody, he's tormented. He doesn't know what's happening to him. We'll get to that in a second. Look, everybody agrees Lucky Gunner is liable. Everybody. Plaintiffs agree. Parents agree. And I agree on behalf of Demetrius. So now that box is checked. You don't have to debate among yourselves. Should Lucky Gunner be held? That's probably the one thing we all agree about. It is a scary thought that a 17-year-old, whether they're mentally disturbed or not, can get online and order ammunition, deadly ammunition that can snuff out life in a microsecond like you order a pizza. Oh, you want delivery? We'll do that too. And we're going to let Lucky Gunner get off. Oh, 10% liability ought to take care of that. And let's put another 30, 40, 50, maybe 100% on Demetrius. But Lucky Gunner, 10%? That is an insult to these families. 10%? You know what the worst thing about it? At least Demetrius has severe mental impairments. But Lucky Gunner, they put profits. They made a calculated business decision. We can make money here. And maybe if somebody calls us out, we'll deal with it. We'll deal with it then. But they made a cold business decision. Profits over the safety of our children. Profits over the safety of our community. Man, that's cold-blooded. That is cold. You award 10% liability to Lucky Gunner. Don't forget to pat them on the back. Hey, keep up the good work. Because that is how they're going to see it. That's how business see it. It's a bottom line. Okay. You know, I heard you don't know what you don't know. Many times in this trial, I'd heard that before. I didn't know it was Socrates till now. Well, here's another one by another great philosopher. You better know what you're supposed to know. Roberto Torres. Okay? August 16, 2024. You better know what you're supposed to know. You can't bury your head in the sand and hope somebody else does your job as a parent. I've heard nothing but excuses. It's the school's fault. That certain questions, it was, maybe the police should have reacted better. This case belongs here, and now. There's three entities, the parents, Demetrius, and Lucky Gunner. It's where it always was supposed to be. No one else. You know, it's the parents' job to keep up. They got report cards, get online and look. They didn't look. They try to say, well, some of these are tardies marked as absence. Okay, same difference. 36 tardies, 50-something absences, tardies, call them what you want. You got access to the school portal? Look at it. That's what it's for. Don't wait for the school to call you. You do your job as a parent. And just because kids are teenagers, you don't just trust them. You don't quit being a parent. I like Ronald Reagan, President Reagan's philosophy, trust but verify, okay? You're the parent. It's your job. They keep talking, well, there was no criminal law. We're not in a criminal court. You wouldn't be here. But there is a duty owed by the parents. And you're being asked to decide whether these folks violated that duty. So, you know, some of these things, okay, I'll give them. Some of these things can be interpreted as teenage angst, I guess. But when you're banging your head in the wall like that, that ain't normal. Okay, that's not normal. And when your kid used to be honest to a fault and is now lying to you, that ain't normal. Coupled with the poor grades, they keep saying, well, he didn't fail. Well, you know what? The school year didn't end. He would have failed, except May 18, 2018 put a stop to that. And then, look, come on. If a kid takes a bath all the time and suddenly stops taking a bath, I am going to say, hey, what's up? Something is wrong. Then your hair starts getting all greasy and matted. Come on. You can't you can't see red flags if you don't open your eyes. Then, of course, you know, there's no computer monitoring. You know, as the friend Balachandra, I believe it was his name, Dr. Balachandra, said, you know, the computer comes with built-in parenting monitors. That's what they're for. Just because a kid is 17, even if you don't suspect your kid is up to no good, you still monitor because there's people out there up to no good trying to get to you. You know, when I was a young man, my parents used to worry about running the streets and who we're running it with. Today, the world runs with your kids. They come into your home through your computer, through social media on your smartphone. Fine, give your kids everything that we didn't have, but we got a responsibility to put these powerful tools in the hands of children. You can discreetly monitor without intruding his privacy. You know, one of the reasons they couldn't monitor because he wouldn't leave his room. And they probably didn't want to confront him. Seems like they were content leaving him in his room. You monitor your kid's computer to protect your children. And in the process, you may discover something about your child that you find disturbing. And then you take action. But if you don't search, you're never going to find. And they seem content with that. Same thing with the social media. Same thing with the car. You know, it's your car. It's your responsibility. Same thing with the trailer home. If we only knew what you got to take your head out the sand to know. Now, I give them credit. They did lock the keys up. And that's good. That's real good. But if you don't keep track of the keys, what's the point? Now, whether it's on top of the gun cabinet, the keys, or whether on top of the bedroom cabinet, it doesn't matter to me, and it shouldn't matter to you. Because keeping the keys away from 17 deadly weapons ought to be a little bit more secure than taking care of your bank records and maybe your insurance policy and other papers. Those are two different things. They said, well, he was almost 17. Yeah, but you had a 13-year-old daughter in the house. They conveniently forget that. They always say, Dimitri was almost 17. Sure, but you had a 17-year-old in the house, and you also had a 13-year-old. And sometimes children, even if they don't have bad intentions, out of curiosity, play with firearms and then hurt themselves or someone else. There are good reasons to keep track of your firearms. There was ways to make them more secure too. But, you know, just forget about those extra ways that could have secured. Keep track of the keys. By their own admission, they didn't know where the keys were prior to the shooting, and to this day, they still have no idea where the keys are.
Your Honor, I object. That's a mischaracterization of the evidence.
Again, this is a closing argument. It's your job to determine the facts of the case. And what the attorneys say are argument, not evidence. And again, you base this case on the evidence and the testimony that you've heard during the course of this trial. You may.
Thank you, Your Honor. If you don't look for it, you're not going to find it. And then they said, well, if the school had only told us, well, those same records that they rely on, you know, when they present it, it's starting with the most recent. But if you start in the back and work your way to the top, they started in October of 2017. And then 2 or 3 absences, the plaintiff's math was wrong. There's more than 4 absences. There's 1 in October, 3 in December, I believe, and then going into 2018. And on those, that says the parents were notified, but what did they do? Because even when they got that information, they don't do anything with it. It's nothing but excuses. When it's convenient, Demetrius is a monster. These are the parents of the monster. You know, Frankenstein, the monster, didn't come out of Dr. Victor Frankenstein created him. So you want to call him a monster? That's your boy. Captain Meadows didn't see him as a monster. Even in this horrible, tragic situation, Captain Meadows, I don't know how, but in that moment, he saw something. He knew something that the Demetrius that was lying flat on his back, looking up scared, was not the same Dimitri who only minutes earlier was killing people. Dimitri's not a monster. He did a monstrous thing. But he's not a monster. You know, Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. You know, those words were spoken by plaintiff Mr. Tisdale, who lost his mom, and those words came to him. You know, and in preparing for this case, I never even made that connection, but they're so applicable here. You know, Demetrius, was the Lord Demetrius' shepherd? No. His shepherd was some extraterrestrial supernatural being, an elder god, a demon. Subsequently, he called her Natasha, Satan spelled backwards, hell awaits. He wasn't taking the green pastures to lie down. He paced the floor in his bedroom, banging his head against the wall throughout the night, trying to shake this demon from inside of him. Did he lie by still waters? No. He was in the mother of all psychotic hurricanes. That boy did not know peace. And as the doctors noted, you don't get this disease, schizoaffective disorder, you don't ask for it. He probably got it when he was still in the womb, given that his grandma and mother had experience with that. That boy didn't have a chance. So, plaintiffs will say, he's sane or he's not insane because he planned. As all the doctors noted, that is two different concepts. The first, if planning is based on delusions and hallucinations and thought disorder, then in that person's mind, they're doing the right thing. He planned this shooting. There's no dispute about that. They act like that's a revelation. Dimitri told you in the initial interview. What did he say? I got nothing to hide, because in his mind, he's doing the right thing. When he made the decision based on his delusions, his hallucinations, and his thought disorder, then at that point, planning was no longer about, is this right or wrong? It's all about carrying out the mission. That's all. That's all that is. The decision of right and wrong was made long ago. Mr. Todd referred to the science of, it's a soft science. It is a soft science compared to the other sciences, but it's science nonetheless. It's a recognized field based on years of studies and training and observations and all of the symptoms that the training and education and clinical studies that are out there. Dimitri fits it. It fits him to the T. Dr. Fuller came in and said, I happened to be at the jail and I saw him in passing, and he right away, boom, there's something wrong with this guy. It reminds me when I was growing up, I had a friend, and he had an older brother, and everybody called him Shell Shock. I don't know if he was a veteran. He was old enough to be a Vietnam veteran, but I don't know if he was. But I do know he looked shell-shocked. When you saw him and you knew something was wrong. You don't have to be a psychiatrist because if it was up to the psychiatrist, you wouldn't be sitting there. Texas law says, hey, you guys can make that determination. The psychiatrists are here only to help you understand what's happening. You look at him, you read his journal, look at his video statement, compared to what the doctors are saying, and you know he's insane. There's no question about that. If there was, they'd have brought a witness in with their soft science to say he's not. Now, so we get down to now accountability. Plaintiffs say, let's send a strong message. Let's punish Dimitri. Punish Dimitri? You think Dimitri cares or even has any inkling what's happening here? You make no difference blaming Dimitri. Nothing gets changed blaming Dimitri. May make, with all due respect to these families, it won't change anything, because we'll always have people who are severely mentally disturbed in our lives. We're always going to have them. They're not going away. In fact, our medical system is not set up to deal with them. We usually don't deal with them until they get into the criminal justice system. But I tell you what, we'll get people's attention. You award, the actual damages. I believe they said actual damages would be in excess of $1 billion. Put that against, put 50% on Lucky Gunner, and put 50% on these parents. And every ammunition maker in America is going to wake up and say, you know what? We better rethink how we sell ammunition. You render a judgment against parents. This is not about your constitutional right to bear arms. You have an absolute right to bear arms. This is not about taking away your guns. It's about safely securing your guns to protect your children from harming others and to protect your children from harming themselves. And you render a judgment against them. Every parent who has guns in America, regardless of whether they have a severely disabled person in their home, will look and say, are my weapons secure? You want change? That's what they want. They want change too. They've been lobbying for it. They deserve it. Our legislatures aren't giving it to them. So now it's up to 12 of y'all. That's a big responsibility. There's people all over the world looking at what's happening. Dimitri, man, I don't know what else I could say. I'm not going to rehash through every journal entry, every piece of evidence. Y'all been an attentive jury. Y'all heard what I heard. And at times, I listen to both sides, and I say, Was I sitting in the same trial? You can't use Dimitri as a shield and as a sword. You can't make him the scapegoat here. As Dr. Bradley Peterson noted, that he operates, Dimitri's that is, operates in two universes. There's reality, what all of us see, and there's what he sees. And at times, he seamlessly goes back and forth. But all Dr. Self and Dr. Peterson both agree that that is common in these type of cases. So I'm asking you to go against every instinct there is. I'm here in front of you representing a young man that killed 10 people, wounded 13 others, and I'm asking you to don't put the responsibility on him. I ask that with all due respect to these families, these beautiful, beautiful, beautiful people. Man, missed graduations, missed parties. We got to make this a better world. We can make it happen. We can do it together. And that's what I'm asking you to. Don't make Dimitris the scapegoat. You know he's not right in the head. You know he couldn't control himself. You know that. How can he stop himself? How? Because you know what? If they could, they'd inject somebody like this with the magic drug and all these problems go away. It doesn't exist. And I'm sorry to these families. I'm so sorry.
Yes, can we get connected there? Because we need a slide. Are we where we can, we're good? Okay, so let me just touch on a couple of things. The first is I want you to go watch, and I want you to read. What are we doing here?
I was going to say, Judge, my client needed a short break, if we could take a short break.
Yes, I'll do a short thing.
That's fine.
All right, so, we'll take a very brief break, and then we'll be finishing up the closing arguments. So, take about a 10-minute break. Be back here at 4:15.
All rise for the jury.